Mark 11, follow the chronology. 12. And on the next day, when they had left Bethany, he became hungry, and seeing it at a distance, a fig tree that had leaves, he went to see if perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he answered, said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples were listening. Okay, so then what did they do? Then they came to Jerusalem. So right after that, he goes into the temple. All right, he then cleanses the temple, right? Right. Guys following the order? Curses the fig tree, enters the temple, drives them out for turning it into a house of merchandise. Now notice, when evening came, they were going out of the city. And as they were passing by in the morning, now this is the next day, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. So when did they notice the fig tree was withered? The next day in the morning. When did he curse it? The day before, right before entering the temple, right?
Right.
Everyone got it? But Matthew 21, watch the chronology. Jesus enters the temple, drives out the money changers, overturns the tables, cleanses the house, right?
Right.
Then the next day, it says he was hungry, and then he sees the fig tree, and then he curses it. And it withered right there. And the disciples marveled, saying, how did the fig tree wither all at once? Do you see the chronology is different, guys? Mark, he curses the fig tree, enters the temple, cleanses it, and then it's the next morning they pass by the fig tree and the disciples see it's withered. Matthew, he enters the temple, cleanses the temple, and it's only the morning of the next day. He goes to the fig tree, curses it because there's no food on it, and it withers right there, and then the disciples respond. The chronology is different, isn't it? Okay. Number one, at the time of Christ and the disciples, they didn't have Microsoft Word. They didn't have email. They didn't have computers. Everything was written by hand, ink, right? And a pen, a feather, whatever you use, and a papyrus scroll. That's number one. Number two, a scroll could only contain so much information and detail. So a scroll can only contain so much information, which means number three, writers had to be very selective in what they wrote, what they included, and how they arranged the material. Okay, everyone with me there? This leads me to my fourth point. You will find a pattern when you compare Matthew and Mark. Whenever you find the same story mentioned in Matthew and Mark, you'll find in most instances, Mark gives you more details than Matthew does. Matthew sums up the event, whereas Mark goes into greater details. This is true across the board. Read the story of the woman, right, who had a bleeding disorder, or Jairus' daughter, and compare it to Matthew and Mark. All right. So if you find the stories that Matthew and Mark share in common, in most instances, Mark gives you greater details than Matthew does. Matthew sums up that same story, sums it up, whereas Mark provides greater details. Now, why do you think Matthew would take a story that is found in Mark in greater detail and shorten it and sum it up? Why do you think that's the case?
Probably to focus on other things.
Not only on other things, right? That's part of it. But why is he focusing on other things? Because he wants to include other things in his gospel that are unique to him. And he's got only so much space to do it, right?
Right.
So if you're going to contain more sayings of Christ, more deeds of Christ than Mark. That means you can't go in the level of detail in every story and episode because you're going to run out of room, right?
Right.
So now, would it make sense that we have one writer that will go in greater detail in regards to specific events than another writer, because the writer who goes in greater detail has less material and doesn't include as many stories as Matthew does?
Correct. Yeah, that makes sense.
So now you see why Matthew did what he did, right? Instead of giving you strict chronology, instead of going with, well, Jesus cursed the fig tree, entered the temple, drove out the money changers, cleansed the temple, and the next day they saw the fig tree withered, Matthew decided to combine that event in a single moment to sum it up so you can have more room to discuss the other events, other details that Mark does not include.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Has everyone got what I'm saying? So this is how the gospel is written. Now, unless you're going to impose a 21st century standard of writing biographies or history, but allow the Gospels to write what's known as Greco-Roman biographies histories in light of their historical cultural context and see whether such reporting was acceptable and considered accurate and not fraudulent, then you're going to have a problem. But no one had a problem in the first century because they're writing according to the dictates of first century Greco-Roman biographies and histories, not 21st century. Right? Now, you even find this phenomenon among Matthew and Luke. Everyone got it? So instead of reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from a 21st century lens of how biographies are written, they're not writing in the 21st century. They're not writing to you. You have to go back in time, look at how the Greeks, Romans, and Jews wrote histories and biographies, see what they considered to be acceptable reporting that was accurate and honest and not considered fraudulent, and the Gospels pass with flying colors. So, let me give you another example, this time between Matthew and Luke. So that's the answer, brother. You got the answer?
I got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So always tell them, is this way of reporting the events of Christ inaccurate? If so, according to what standard? What time frame? 21st century reporting or first century reporting?
Right. It would be dishonest to say comparing it to what we have today.
Exactly. They're not written to you. They're written to them. And they know their audience, and they know their audience understand. Because remember, when the gospel is written, they're not written independently from the community. See, this is another thing Protestants forget. When Matthew writes the gospel, he's writing it for the community, which means the community will also have the background information and the details and will be able to understand the context with greater depth. They were not written as standalone, where you go to Barnes and Nobles and pick up a biography on someone you don't know. Keep in mind, they're written to the community. Matthew's writing to his community, a community he spent years with, catechizing, teaching, so they have a lot more information. They have all the background details. So when they read the gospel, they can now understand it with greater clarity because they have the background details given to them by Matthew, because he's writing to the community that he's catechized and trained and spent years with.
Yep.
This is what happens with the Protestant mindset, because it's like me going up to Barnes & Noble's picking up a biography on Bruce Lee. Okay, and it was, all right, well, I know nothing about Bruce Lee except that he's a martial arts star, and I didn't spend any time with him. So let me read a biography about what people said. That's not how the Gospels are written. They're written for the communities that the authors were a part of. Right?
Right.
This is why you'll find often they make passing comments that for you and I make no sense, but makes perfect sense to the community they're writing to. So they know if they mention something in passing without going into detail, The audience will already know. They'll pick it up. I'll give you an example. So you asked me a good question, brother. So in light of first century reporting, the Gospels pass with flying colors. So does Acts. Watch this comment, which is not found in Matthew and Luke, because Matthew and Luke are not writing to the same audience. Mark 15:21. Church tradition says Mark was writing at Rome, and he was writing down what Peter preached in Aramaic, and he wrote it in Greek. That's early church tradition. That's universal and reliable. And they pressed into service a passerby by coming from the countryside, Simon of Cyrene, or Cyrene, the father of Alexander Rufus, to carry his cross. Why did he even mention this? How is this relevant to me? Because I have no idea who Alexander Rufus are. So why didn't he mention this?
I guess because the people there knew who this person was, so...
Persons, not person, right?
Right.
Because he says, the father of Alexander and Rufus.
Yeah.
So why in the world does he mention that Simon has two sons named Alexander Rufus? A detail not mentioned in Matthew 2, when you and I today have no clue who these individuals are.
Right. Well, because I'm the way I see it is Simon of Cyrene. There might be more than one Simon of Cyrene, but you would know them by their parents.
Simon of Cyrene, right?
Right, but you would know them by their
There's
parents.
more than one. How does mentioning his kids help you out?
It's just like a more like identification.
For who? Who are Alexander and Rufus? Okay, now here I'm gonna turn on you. All right, so Simon Cyrene, father Alexander Rufus. Sound familiar? Do you know who Alexander Rufus are?
I do not.
So what relevance does this have for you?
For me, none, but for the people at that time, it might have
Okay,
more.
so why did he mention the detail of that his sons are Alexander and Rufus? That the Gospels are written to communities. They're not written in isolation, standalone writings. They're written for communities that the authors have spent time with, and that these audiences that they're writing to would know the background details, because they know the authors, because the authors would have spent time with them, and they're writing this to them. And so at times they don't need to go in details, which you guys are not getting. So just to test you to see if you're listening, why did Matthew take the cursing of the fig tree, which happened on an evening, and then the disciples discovering the fig tree being cursed, which happened the next morning, and condense that event into one day, giving the impression all happened at that morning and after he entered the temple? Matthew wants to condense the stories that we find Mark mentioning in greater detail, because he has more to talk about and he has only so much room. But I'm not saying this is necessarily dependent on Mark. That's not what I said. Let me repeat it again. If you read Matthew and Mark, you're going to see Mark is only 16 chapters. Matthew's 28. Mark has less material than Matthew. Mark has less events, episodes than Matthew. So Mark can talk about an event in greater detail because he has less stories to include in a scroll. Matthew has a lot more stories not found in Mark. Some are found in Luke, some are not. So he has to make room for these stories that he wants to include along with those stories that are found in Mark. Not because he's dependent on Mark. That wasn't my argument. So the stories found in Mark when you read in Matthew, you find they're summed up. Now, the reason why he's going to sum them up isn't because he's aware of Mark. That's not my argument. He may be aware of Mark or not. That's not my argument. I know he's summing up the details because I have Mark. That doesn't mean Matthew has Mark. I'm saying I, with hindsight, can see, Mark has more details about the woman, right, was bleeding and Jairus' daughter than Matthew. But Matthew has more stories than Mark. So it has nothing to do with their dependency. It has to do with just common sense. Oh, so Matthew is going to sum up these stories to make more room for the other stories because he has less room to do so because he has a scroll that can only contain so much details. Now, whether he's aware of Mark or not is irrelevant to the argument. You understand? Do we get that, man? You understand? And even in those stories that Matthew records, he may not be going in great detail anyway. He may be summing those stories up too. So my argument does not depend on Matthew being aware of Mark. He may not. My argument can stand alone. I only use that because I see that when Mark reports a story that Matthew reports, I see that Mark has more details than Matthew, but Mark is shorter than Matthew because he has less stories to report than Matthew does. So Matthew has to now sum up and condense because he has a lot more to include in a scroll that can only contain so much information. Secondly, let me hammer this point. You don't judge writings of the first century by 21st century methods of reporting. We have writings, and this has been documented by Mike Licona. Do not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Mike Licona has studied the writings of Greek historians and what they said about how to write biographies and histories, like Thucydides. He's actually examined them, and they've given rules how to write history and biography. Mike has done great work in this field. He's done great work, Mike Licona. It's called Compositional Devices. I don't agree with everything he says, but he's done his work to show that the Greek writers, Latin writers, came up with rules saying, like Thucydides, here's how you do history and biography. In the first century Greco-Roman biography histories, writers were permitted to rearrange material to write in a less strict chronological manner, to arrange material topically, not chronologically. In other words, it was acceptable for you to arrange events according to topics, not chronology. So if you're arranging material according to topics, you can take an event that comes later and place it at the beginning of your writing if you're writing topically, not chronologically. Okay, you got it? So when you judge the Gospels according to first century standards of Greco-Roman biographies and histories, they pass with flying colors. The only thing they were not allowed to do was make things up and lie, which they didn't. So they're reporting the same events, but they're not reporting it the same way. Sometimes they'll rearrange the order or condense it, but nonetheless, they are basing it on actual events and sayings. We got this? Because I'm going to give you an example of how Matthew and Luke will arrange the same event in a different order. So what does Holy Spirit do? Holy Spirit meets people where they're at and will then employ the methods used by the culture, methods that the culture deems to be accurate reporting, and use those methods to communicate the gospel. The Holy Spirit doesn't invent new genres or ways of reporting. The Holy Spirit will meet people where they're at and will then incorporate, right, the very practices and customs of the cultures, provided they're not sinful or wicked, and incorporate them in communicating the gospel of Christ in a language that makes sense to them. All right, now, with that said, let me give you one example. Now watch Matthew and Luke rearrange the order of the temptation. Rearrange the order of the temptation. You ready? The three temptations, watch the order. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he then became hungry. And the tempter came and said to him, if you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread. But he answered and said, it is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. So it begins with the temptation, turn stones into bread. Temptation number 2. Then the devil took him into the holy city and had him stand on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. Jesus said to him, again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to test. So the second temptation here is, throw yourself off the peak of the temple, that huge height, because if you survive, that would be miraculous. All right, that's second temptation. Third temptation is to get Jesus to worship Satan. Third temptation. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory, and he said to them, all these things I will give you if you fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, go, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and began to minister to him. So, temptation number 2 in Matthew, throw yourself off from the peak of the temple. Right? Number 3 is worship me. Watch Luke. Now Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was being led around by the Spirit in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by the devil. And he ate nothing during those days. And when they had finished, he was hungry, and the devil said to him, if you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread. And Jesus answered him, it is written, man shall not live on bread alone. So they both agree. This is, the first temptation, right? They both agree. The first temptation is turn stone into bread, right? All right. What's the second temptation? Second temptation here is, then the devil took him to the city, throw yourself from the temple. Luke, the second temptation is worship Satan. Right? And he led him up. Notice second temptation is different. He led him up and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. And the devil said to him, I will give you all this dominion and its glory, for it has been handed over to me, and I give it to whoever I wish. Therefore, if you worship me, it shall be yours. And Jesus answered and said to him, it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Luke's second temptation is Matthew's third temptation. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. Do you guys see it? Luke's second temptation is Matthew's third. In Matthew, the third temptation is the devil tempting Jesus to worship him. Right? In Luke, that's a second temptation. Now watch Luke's third temptation. You ready? Now, third temptation. And he led him to Jerusalem and had him stand on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you. And on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. And Jesus answered, said to him, it is said, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Luke's third temptation is Matthew's second. See that? The orders are reversed. LaPont, everyone else got it? Now, here's another thing you may not notice. Let's look at the Greek. Because the Greek gives you a clue that one of them is not following strict chronology. Watch here. One of them is not following strict chronology. Let's see which one. Let me enlarge it. Okay, let's go here. Okay, and having fasted 40 days, he was hungry, and having come to the one tempting him, he said, if you are the Son of God, speak that the stones these loaves bread might become. But answering, it has been written, not, right? Coming out. Now watch here. 2T. 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 Look what Matthew adds. 2T. Then, at that time. That time, then. See the word 2T? Okay, keep in mind. 2T, right? Keep that the adverb in mind, not preposition. All right, so that's the second. Then again, what happens? Let's go down. All right. Then again, Palin or Pauline. Again, Pauline. Let's look at here. Again, once more, back. Again, back, once more. You see, Matthew uses phrases that imply sequence, right? Sequence, correct? You guys catching it? All right. Now let's look at Luke, though. Let's look at Luke. Let's see what words he uses. K. No tutti, no Pauline. K means and. And does not refer to strict sequence. It simply means and. See the difference now? He doesn't use the phrases that Matthew uses, tutti, Pauline, which argues more that Matthew's giving you the chronology. Luke is simply giving you the temptation, but not in a strict chronological order. Do you see it? Pick up on these points that the Spirit moved the writers to write down. How about the third one? Okay, right? And having led. Right? Let's go back to the other one. Watch here. Right here, verse 9. He led him also, that too doesn't have to refer to strict chronology. Also means also, and also he did this. But doesn't mean he did it exactly right after. Moreover, he also did this. A weak adversative particle generally plays second in its clause, but on the other hand, and. So, one can argue that Matthew is most likely giving you the chronology, whereas Luke is simply grouping the temptations, not in a strict chronological order.